Welcome to tutorial 1 of the Sex Rights Africa, making sexual and reproductive health and rights a reality. This is a 4-part series and I hope that you make time to watch all of them. I have entitled this series Going Far with Legal, and you will understand what that means, especially if you work in the civil society where we are always cash strapped. So, tutorial 1 is about strengthening local collaborations for resource mobilization and sharing. My name is Mzi Nduna, and when I'm not teaching students who are enrolled for psychology courses, I work with community-based organizations to bridge the gap between science, theory, and practice. So for our first tutorial, it's important that we make you understand where this is coming from. We're going to be sharing information in the next 3 tutorials, and this information comes from a project that the AIDS Foundation of South Africa implemented. So the AIDS Foundation of South Africa implemented a sexual and reproductive health and rights intervention with partners in selected communities in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Eastern Cape, and in Mpumalanga in South Africa. The sizes of the community-based organizations that we worked with were more or less the same. They had about maybe 7 to 11 full-time employed staff members. They also had volunteers who worked on these projects. The interventions were delivered by both the paid staff and the volunteers, and the staff varied in age and gender. Whilst it is ideal to accommodate other aspects such as disability, such as language, such as sexual orientation and gender identity, it is not always possible to do so. And so we didn't quite have information about some of these aspects in terms of diversity. The implementing partners could sustain the organizations and their programs through the funding that they received from the AIDS Foundation of South Africa. They had peer educators who were also paid a stipend from the funding, and these peer educators were at the forefront of running the workshops. We then collected data so that we could evaluate the impact of these projects in these communities. Through this project, we interviewed about 3 to 4 staff members in each organization. We selected people at different levels, and the people that were interviewed, for example, were the directors, the project coordinators, and the field workers. The questions for all these interviews slightly differed from organization to organization. Why? Because the implementation was contextual. It differed from site to site. We audio recorded all of those interviews. We transcribed them, and we are going to tell you in this 4-part series what are some of the things that we learned from these interviews. The target group for each of the implementing partners was defined. So I'm going to tell you about 3 implementing partners. In KwaZulu-Natal, for example, we had the Gay and Lesbian Network. Some of you might know it. It is based in Pietermaritzburg. We also had the KwaZulu-Natal Regional Christian Council. You may know it. It is based in Eshowe. We also had a national organization which you all should know, the Treatment Action Campaign. They also worked in a place called Gersibande. The organizations decided their specific target groups. And the approach that they seem to have used, which we learned when we were doing this evaluation study, is what I'm going to call the fission and the fusion model, which is a model where you bring people together, but you also allow them to go apart. So, for example, you would bring men together, you would bring women together, you would bring young people together as separate groups, but you also allow them to mix at some points. So that is the fission and the fusion model. So for example, the KwaZulu-Natal Regional Christian Council worked with groups of women, they worked with groups of men, they worked with groups of specific vulnerable groups, for example, the sex workers. And this is what one of their staff members told us when we interviewed them, that as part of this work, they have been able to develop a very strong men's forum whereby men attend together and have their own community dialogues together. So in this way, we call these peer groups, and these are desirable in order to increase participation and attendance, especially when we are discussing sexual and reproductive health matters. And sometimes these matters may be considered to be taboo and conservative by some of our communities. I'm going to tell you a bit about what the Gay and Lesbian Network in Pietermaritzburg did. They had programs that they described as all-inclusive. By all-inclusive, they meant that they did not only work with the queer people, they worked with the general community, because they believed that it is the attitudes of the general community that need to be changed so that the communities are made safer for the LGBTI community. They also considered including work in areas that, you know, when we talk about community-based organizations, sometimes there is a tendency to imagine all the time that these are for Black African communities. And in the Gay and Lesbian Network, they made it a point to work in Indian communities in KZN, to work in colored communities in KZN, to work with white populations, to work with everybody, because for them, non-racialism was the core principle for their work. Yes, they did experience challenges, and one of the challenges that they shared with us was that their work is based on the Constitution. So it is about educating people about their human rights as enshrined in the Constitution. Guess what? The Constitution is only in English at the time. I am hoping that there has been work now to translate the Constitution and make the translated versions available widely. So because the copies of the Constitution in South Africa that are mostly available for distribution are in English, they found that to be a challenge when they worked in communities that spoke and could understand only Zulu. And this is one of the areas of advocacy that they are hoping to take forward. So some of their staff had already worked for other projects in the communities before, and that was a strength, because when they had worked in those projects, they bring the networks, and networks are very important in the work that we do, not only because the name of the organization is Gay and Lesbian Network, but generally for all the CBOs, it's very important that we think about networking, and networking. Also, GLN, as it is fondly known around the community, worked with the friends of the gay community. They worked with families of the gay community and the people that we describe as significant others. And their work mainly involved distributing information and also encouraging support and acceptance. And in terms of what they identified as the gap in the greater Pietermaritzburg, Umgungundlovu area is a lack of knowledge and deep understanding of the rights that are in the Constitution. And that is the basics for our ability to claim our sexual and reproductive rights. It's to know the Constitution and how the Constitution can be understood in order to protect us. I want to move and tell you a bit about the KwaZulu-Natal Regional Christian Council, which is based in Eshowe. Amongst their target groups, they also worked with a group of vulnerable women and men who were engaged in sex work. They described this as informal trade. When working with marginalized groups who are involved in an activity such as sex work in South Africa, which continues to be criminalized, KRCC, as they are fondly known, described to us their successes and challenges in working with sex workers. And one of their coordinators said, I can't say that they are safe, the sex workers, because they are not professional. You find them working in the streets, and then if you had a chance to talk to one of them, they can invite others. So whilst it is a challenge to find them because they work in the streets, they are not an organized group. But it's also possible that through a snowballing approach, you can approach one or two and they can find their colleagues and they can bring them to the community dialogues. And what was important for the people that we spoke with at KRCC was that it's important that you separate your Christian values from your professional values. And one of the coordinators said that when they are here, the sex workers, when they are in the office for community dialogues and workshops and training, she said, it's very important that you don't judge them, but that they understand that you have brought them together so that you can work with them. What we have found across these organizations, TAC, KRCC, and GLN, is that The interventions that they developed were interventions that were based on their own local research. There is research that we published at Baseline, and if you go to the AIDS Foundation of South Africa website, you will find the reports on sexual realities. And those reports informed the interventions that were developed. Also, they made it very clear to us that their approaches were multi-stakeholder approaches, which means that there were different stakeholders that were involved at a particular time in delivering the interventions. Some of the methods that they mentioned to us that they used were approaches such as the community dialogues, or the CCCE, as it is usually abbreviated. They used interactive workshops, they used drama, they used video documentaries, they used digital stories, and these were all the approaches that they used as part of their interventions. They also, because in most of these communities in South Africa, you will find that we have community radio stations, and these are a very powerful medium for reaching out to the communities. And especially when the guests at the community radio stations are actually people who come from the same communities and from the local organizations. That has benefits because they speak the same language as the people. They are known to the communities and trusted as community workers. But also it means that when people have follow-up questions, they can follow up with the guests because the guests are accessible and known to them. This is not to say community radio stations cannot have guests that are at a national level or that are outside of those communities, but they need to make sure that those guests are able to communicate in a language that is accessible to the communities. So these organizations, TAC, KRCC, and GLN, used local community radio stations where they had slots in these. There's a few successes that they told us. KRCC told us about branching out of sexual and reproductive health, for example, to form savings clubs. They formed savings clubs with women, and when they started these groups, there were only about 6 groups, and by the time we had an interview with them, they had grown to 31 savings clubs, and that's incredible because we know how difficult it is to sustain the savings clubs. We also learned from GLN that they also did more than just sexual and reproductive health in the communities where they worked with in Maritzburg. And we all know the work of the TAC goes beyond working with HIV. So the most important thing also, South Africa has what we call the youth bulge. We have more young people than children and the elderly. Why? Because in South Africa, we have benefited from our reproductive rights, and people have had children at a younger age, and then we have these multiple generations. So because we have the youth bulge, we have a lot of young people, it's very important that programs consider that. And across the board, that was one of our findings, that it was not only the beneficiaries who were young people, but also the people who were delivering the interventions, the peer educators, the field workers, the people who were employed as coordinators were also young people. Collaborations are very important in the work that we do for service delivery. Why? Because we need to share resources. Resources are not always in abundance in the civil society. We know that. So when we use a multi-stakeholder approach as used by these organizations, you are able to share your resources. You are able to work in a way that is collegial. You are able to work in a way that is not competitive. And we saw this happening between these organizations where they would invite each other. So if, for example, your strength is HIV, you then get invited to an organization that's working on LGBTI to come and talk about that. If your strength is community development, you get to invite the LGBTI organization to come and talk to your community. And this way of working was also supported by the AIDS Foundation of South Africa through what they call learning and sharing platforms, where they bring together all their sub-grantees to come and share their experiences. There are 2 things I want to talk about before I close, which are very important for sharing Through these networks, we are able to share space, but also we are able to share platforms. So when I say we are able to share space, I'm not only referring to the civil society organizations. We are also able to share space with the government. For example, JLN in Pietermaritzburg told us that through their networks and partnerships with the government, they were then able to set up what I'm going to call health desks within the premises of the clinics. Remember, the clinics belong to the government, not to JLN. But JLN was able to use the clinics without paying for the clinic space. And so that is the power of sharing. That is the power of the networks, that you get to be able to work in a particular resource. The infrastructure is not your infrastructure, but you are able to use that infrastructure at no cost to you. And that is why it is important. Because JLN, what they found was that the nurses had the space, the nurses had the clients because people were coming to the clinics, but the nurses did not know enough about sexual and reproductive health as it pertains to the LGBTI community. And so GLN brought that to the space. But they also shared platforms. So for example, if you are going to have a training, then you can join with other organizations, and you have a joint session for your training. That then helps to save resources, but to reach out to more people. So when you do that, you also need to consider that, yes, there are challenges with this, and we're going to discuss these challenges in the next tutorials. So yes, there are challenges with what we call piggybacking, because you piggyback on another organization. So for now, let me thank you for watching our first tutorial and talking about strengthening networks and accelerating impact. I then partnered with the Center for the Study of AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria, and we produced this book from the work of the AIDS Foundation of South Africa. And this book is freely available online. You can download it by searching the title, A Magnifying Glass and a Fine-Tooth Comb, Understanding Girls and Young Women's Sexual Vulnerability. The contents of this book are all informed by the work of the AIDS Foundation of South Africa Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights Reality. I hope you enjoyed this background information to this 4-part series, and that you are going to now click and watch our second tutorial, which is now going to go deeper into our findings. Thank you, and enjoy tutorial 2.